Yep, so just to introduce the term food standards, this covers a very broad range of areas relating to food law. And as the slide shows, this includes aspects such as food labelling, traceability, food fraud, and of course allergens. The next slide. Yeah, so as I said in the previous slide, food standards covers a very broad range of issues. And this slide gives you a flavour of the amount of different pieces of legislation that is enforced by local authorities in relation to the food labelling aspects of food law. So obviously our specific focus today is allergens, and particularly the new rules around pre-packed for direct sale foods. However, it's important for you as a business to be aware of any specific pieces of legislation that affect the way the food you're producing should be labelled. And the Food Standards Agency have lots of useful information on their website in relation to food labelling. So I'll put in the chat now some links to their advice pages. They also have some e-learning modules on food safety generally, and this includes training on labelling, allergens and traceability, etc. So I'll put a link to this in the chat as well. Next slide, please. So moving on to allergens now. So this slide shows the 14 allergens as prescribed by the retained EU regulation on the provision of food information to consumers, which is regulation number 1169/2011. So for your reference, I'll put a link to that in the chat now. So as you can see, we've got peanuts, and you'll notice that this is classed as a separate allergen to nuts. And nuts includes all of our nuts, including almonds, hazelnuts, walnuts, cashews, pecan nuts, etc. And then you've got shellfish, and this is separated into two categories: crustaceans and mollusks. Fish, eggs, milk, cereals containing gluten. So this includes wheat, rye, barley, oats and spelt, etc. Soybeans or soya, sesame seeds, celery, mustard, lupin, and sulfur dioxide and sulfites. Next slide, please. So these are the three categories of food labelling that you should be aware of. So today we're focusing predominantly on pre-packed for direct sale foods. But it's important for context to understand the differences between them and to recognise which type of food you're supplying, as this will affect how the allergens information should be provided to the consumer. So looking at pre-packed food, this is food that you may buy in from your suppliers that's already packaged and labelled, and which you provide to the consumer in that form. Or it might be foods that you're packing and labelling yourselves and supplying to the food businesses for supply to the final consumer. So these foods must meet the full labelling requirements under the Food Information to Consumers Regulation, which includes the requirement to have a list of ingredients and any allergens emphasised. Then of course there's pre-packed for direct sale food, which is subject to the new rules, which we're going to go through today. Non-pre-packed food, so this is food that you're selling ready to eat to the final consumer. So for example, food plated in a cafe or restaurant, or it might be foods that are on display in a chiller or cabinet, unpackaged and ready for the consumer to order. So for example, pies or pastries which you place in a bag or box after the consumer places their order. So now we're going to look at the requirements for pre-packed food labelling. So firstly, you need the name of the food, and this has to be one of three types of name. Some foods have what's called a legal name, which is a prescribed name in food law, or something called a reserved description. So a reserved description applies for certain foods which have specific compositional criteria. So examples of these are things like sausage, burger, jam or honey. Some foods have what's called a customary name, and these are names that have become familiar with consumers over time. So for example, Bakewell tart or fish fingers. And then finally, if there's no legal or customary name, a business must use a descriptive name. And this is a name that's descriptive enough to indicate the true nature of the food to consumers and distinguish it from other foods which could be confused with. The Food Standards Agency have got a guidance document on food names, and there's also a useful.gov.uk page on compositional requirements and reserved descriptions, so I'll put a link to those in the chat now. So as well as the name of the food, it must have a list of ingredients given in descending order of weight, headed with the title ingredients. Also, if the food contains any of the 14 allergens, these must be contained and emphasized within the ingredients list. The quantity of certain ingredients must be given, expressed as a percentage of the total ingredients, and this is called a quantitative ingredients declaration, or QID for short. And this requirement applies where the ingredient is included in the name of the food, or usually associated with that food, or could be an ingredient which is emphasized on the packaging in words, pictures, or graphics, or it could be an ingredient which is essential to characterize the food and distinguish it from similar products. So the labeling must also include a net quantity, a use by or best before date, storage conditions for the food, the name and address of the food business operator, a country of origin where any failure to give this might mislead the consumer as to the true origin of the food, instructions for use, so for example any preparation or cooking instructions, and the alcoholic strength where this is applicable, and a nutritional declaration. So that's just a brief summary of the labelling requirements for pre-packed food, but the links I put in the chat have some good detailed guidance on the different elements, so I highly recommend that you check those out if you need more information. So now we're going to move on to the requirements for non-pre-packed foods. So there's certain information that still has to be given to the consumer, despite the food not having individual labelling. So this is the name of the food, the presence of any of the 14 allergens, and for products containing meat, they need an indication of quantity of that meat expressed as a percentage of the total ingredients. But note that the indication of quantity requirement for meat products doesn't apply to food sold to the final consumer at a catering establishment. So like, for example, food sold in a cafe or restaurant. With regards to the name of the food and the QID declaration for meat products, this must be provided to consumers one of two ways, either on a label attached to the food or on a notice, ticket or label that's clearly visible to the customer. So in relation to the allergen information, food businesses aren't required by law to provide a full ingredients list, but they must provide information about the use of allergenic ingredients in the food. So this information doesn't need to be given in writing, but if a business is providing verbal information, then there must be clear signposting to direct the consumer to where or how this information can be obtained, for example, by asking a member of staff. So if the business is choosing this method, then they've got to ensure that the accurate information is being provided by staff. So therefore, ingredients information must be in a form that they can easily refer to, such as a recipe book, a chart, or ingredients information sheets. Another method is to have what's called an allergens matrix. And Kate is going to highlight an example of one of these shortly.
So to start off, I want to talk a bit about allergens in general in the food business, and by saying that procedures must be in place under current regulations to deal with customers with allergies and intolerances. Information on all the allergens must be available when requested by a customer, whether this would be face-to-face, over the telephone, or online ordering. This is a customer sign which you should all be familiar with. This sign should be prominently displayed for customers to see and have that discussion with staff about any allergens in the foods so they can make an informed choice. The sign is a legal requirement to display as it encourages the customer to declare their allergies and have that discussion with the business. The law requires a business to provide accurate and verifiable information about allergens. You must not guess, and you are not allowed to say you do not know what is in the food, and you cannot say that the food could contain an allergen. This is different to may contain statements, which I will discuss later on. You need to know what is in the food. So in relation to PPDS, we would also recommend that the sign is also displayed near PPDS foods so that a discussion can still take place if a customer wishes to. So for PPDS food, you're still required to implement many of the measures that you do already. So for example, training, HACCP, food preparation procedures, communication between staff and suppliers, and a good hygiene practice. The same principles of allergen management apply to all foods. Next slide, please. So although the main focus of today is about PPDS, I want to also touch on allergen management in general. So moving on to discussions between the business and the customer, it is important when managing customer requests about allergens that clear and accurate information is passed on to the customer. Ultimately is to ensure the correct dish is passed to the customer. Some of the points which need to be considered when you're looking at how you handle requests about the presence of allergens in foods include things such as how will you identify allergen risks? A risk assessment must be undertaken and must be pertinent to your business. For example, storage, spillage controls, cross-contact, contamination, preparation, training and effective communication. All of these things need to be considered when assessing allergen risks. You will need to demonstrate to enforcement officers the steps that you have taken to assess that risk and what controls you've put in place to control the risk of allergens. Think about everyday procedures and what controls you need to be in place and the steps that you have taken. For PPDS foods, the same applies and you will need to make sure you follow your risk assessment. Look at the steps involved when designing dishes, writing menus, storage of foods, including chilling and freezing. So, what is the procedure to be followed when taking orders from customers with an allergy or an intolerance? Consider things such as training on the procedure, which must be followed at all times. How will you record customer requests? Staff should not be expected to memorise allergen ingredients for the foods, so there must be a really robust procedure in place. And identify who is responsible. Is it the chef or the manager, or will it be a supervisor? Importantly, implement your risk assessment and train the team on their roles and responsibilities and ensure the staff are supervised. And also make sure your risk assessment is in line with your overall food safety management system or HACCP. So with training, this consists of a variety of things. Will you provide in-house training, such as on the job? Will it be external, maybe a food safety consultant, or perhaps a mixture of both? Training must include all members of staff relevant in their role in your business. And don't forget to review training regularly or when required. So for example, the new PPDS rules will mean that new training is now required for those businesses affected. And when something goes wrong, perhaps a near miss or an incident occurs, you need to think, you need to sort of review training and update training as and when required. Also, do staff know what to do if a customer does suffer an allergic reaction? So basic first aid provision is important to understand what to do in that situation, how to assist the person, because it can be the difference between life and death. A business is responsible in ensuring there is always a trained staff member present when handling allergen requests. And what training to provide to staff. There's lots of training materials out there, and this must be reviewed and updated in your food safety management system. And another important thing just to mention is that near misses, if they happen, they should be reported, reviewed, and most importantly, acted upon. So mistakes do not happen again. Processes must be in place. They should be updated in your HACCP or food safety management system, and this should be communicated to staff. Open communication is key, and look at the underlying causes of what happened, why it happened, to prevent that reoccurrence. Next slide, please. So we should all be aware of these 14 allergens, and Tim covered these earlier. The new PPDS rules will help people with allergens to other ingredients, as there are many other ingredients that people are allergic to. So having an ingredients list will be helpful for those individuals. So this is an example of a matrix chart used in many food businesses, which, as you can see, it lists the dishes and then the 14 allergens are listed across the top. And you simply tick if each dish contains any of the 14 allergens. you must make sure to list any presence of allergens in any of your dishes. Although this sounds simple, some of the issues that we see during our inspections include out-of-date matrices, because these should be updated and checked. Hidden ingredients not included, for example, marinades, breadcrumbs, nut in oil, powders, garnishes, syrups, etc. All these must be included. Supplier changes could also be a problem, where a business has changed suppliers since completing the matrix, and although the dish and ingredients may be similar, the actual ingredients may differ. For example, one brand of chicken nuggets may have an allergen in that another brand doesn't, vice versa. Not retaining allergen information from manufacturers can be another issue, so putting labels and packaging in the bin that contain the allergen information, and then you no longer have that information to hand when a customer requests. So do you need to have a system of recording the allergens from your supplier? Another error could be where the may contain from the manufacturer has not been carried over to your matrix. The may contains should also be on the matrix as a may contain, and this enables staff to have that conversation with the customer when asked, and they should be prompted to ask about any allergens or intolerances by that customer sign that I showed earlier. The allergen matrix should form part of daily opening checks. This would be to check that all suppliers remain the same, there hasn't been a last minute substitution for an ingredient for a dish, and if any new staff are aware and trained in handling allergen requests. As you look for other daily checks, such as pest control, hot water and temperatures, the allergen matrix and your allergen procedures should form part of your daily checks as well. And product recalls. So if a product used in any of your dishes is suddenly recalled due to the presence of undeclared allergens, then this must be actioned immediately. This is why having good paperwork, traceability records of all your suppliers in place is really important.